And congratulations to you and your team for putting together this intense webathon back-to-back sessions. Very good day to all our listeners and our panelists. We're joined today with Garima Dadic. She's Associate Professor of Business Environment at the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, Ministry of Corporate Affairs in India. Suranjali Tandon, she's the assistant professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, which comes under the Ministry of Finance in India. And Gursharan Bansal, he's the chief general manager of India Post Payments Bank, one of the recent entrants into the payment banking systems in India. They have joined us today in furthering this conversation on this topic of financing a just transition in the context of the VUCA world that we're living in, VUCA as in the volatile world that we're living in. So, we've been faced with successive humanitarian crises. So first the COVID pandemic hit us, and then this particular, the Russian-Ukraine conflict. And this is happening in a world that has already been racked by the visible impacts of climate change related environment and social shocks. And that's the grim reality of the mega trends of the world that we face. These are all mega trends: climate change, geopolitical issues, pandemic issues. These are all mega trends. And the issue here really is that how do we address one mega trend vis-a-vis the other? What takes precedent or priority over others? How do we ensure that the others don't get derailed? For instance, climate change has been slow to pick up globally, but it still has been picking up momentum, which is a positive. And within climate change, the effort towards just transition of workers from brown to green sectors in order to reduce the social risks that arise from this journey towards a low carbon transition world has been a bit slower to pick up, but nevertheless picking up in conversations now. So at the same time, this concept of just transition is very clear and pressing issue for large population developing countries from the perspective of socio-economic stability, or even if you view it just from a vote bank lens. But when mega trends like conflict situations come up in some part of the world, which has rippling effects on sectors in other countries across, as is happening now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where a number of sectors in countries like India have also been impacted. Now, there is a risk in these situations that climate action and just transition within that, it may end up taking a backseat in some of these countries who are directly or indirectly impacted by such conflicts. And we need to ensure that does not happen. So for example, this conflict in Russia-Ukraine has hit trade and investment flows worldwide. The issue around food crisis is probably the most alarming. Production distribution channels have been hit. Prices are at record highs. At the same time, industrial energy costs have also increased. We're also already seeing a situation in India where high heat waves is driving demand for electricity while supply is falling short. So already putting strain on the power system. Let's also recall that the shift from coal to oil that happened around the time of World War I, or the emergence of nuclear energy as a power source, which happened around the time of World War II, implies that sometimes conflict can actually play a big part in accelerating energy transition situations historically. Now, this Russia-Ukraine crisis in a world already seeing the visible effects of climate change now forces us to ensure that just transition strategies, initiatives, they're not derailed, and otherwise we will end up derailing all the effort we have been doing on the climate front. It is also a situation where public finance was already stretched as it was. The pandemic recovery costs have stretched it even further. And that means private sector capital really needs to step in a meaningful way for just transition. And for that, we need to create a conducive ecosystem for that private sector capital to flow in. Now, how do we make this possible? How do we scale it to a level that we require? That would be the focus of the discussion today. So with this, let me turn to our panelists, Garima, Suranjali, and Gursharan. Welcome to this panel event. First of all, let me take a view from all of you on this question that, there is this war happening in Ukraine, and that has devastating impacts on people and, on industries, on sectors across the world, which is already getting impacted by climate change. So in your view, a part of this new world situation that it does not get derailed. Let's start with you, Garima, followed by Suranjali and Gursharan. Over to you, Garima.
Yeah, thank you, Surajit, and thank you very much for having us here for this important discussion. So, as you have rightly said, I'll just begin by just restating that just transition involves preparing the workforce to fully participate in the low carbon economy and identifying and supporting the inclusive economic opportunities to the entire community and putting communities in front and center in discussions that affect their livelihoods. We have seen that Russia-Ukraine crisis is already a big human catastrophe, and it has also proved that it is a disastrous for climate action by showing the global energy transition. As you have also highlighted, we know that both these countries are key suppliers of crucial metals, and there is a which is used in the manufacturing of the green technology, and we are talking about the renewable energy such as solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicle and all that. So these concerns are very much acknowledged by the several researchers that the energy security are also spurring the fossil fuel imports and have triggered this pause in Australia also to delay emission. Even the Germany is also rethinking of their net zero short-term plans, or exit coal and the use of nuclear power and all that. So entire world is talking about these things. Now, I would like to say that we should not focus on Ukraine only, right? Such situations may emerge with any country in future. What we need is a robust policy and a deep-rooted philosophy that can guide actions on people of leaders of countries, because this can happen anytime. So a nation is responsible to provide the essential social services to its citizens, as we all know. Post-war rehabilitation exercises are also focused on such necessities, which is again an obvious reaction from the government of any nation. And we know that wars affect the environment and climate in two ways. One is the direct, or we can say the immediate impact, which it has on atmosphere, or which it has on amount of greenhouse gases, carbon, pollution, etc. And the second is not the immediate, but a long-term indirect impact, and which can, in the form of an infrastructural development, which can be in the form of industrial development from scratch, right? Ukraine has made, substantial progress on climate action in the past years. Before war, I'm talking about that. Before war, they made a substantial progress. Despite having a difficult, political and economic situation, such commitments have been appreciated also. As per this 2021 NDCs, right, nationally determined challenges submitted by the Ukraine, there is a significant improvement of its previous target of 40% reduction to the new target of 65% reduction below 1990 level by 2030. And they have also announced, and I quote, climate neutrality by 2060. Right? So earlier also, Ukraine had faced difficulties in accessing finance for climate action. Its GDP per capita is amongst the lowest in Europe. The NDC modeling undertaken by the government indicated that the total financing need of around 540 billion euro in the 2020 to 2030, the one decade, for implementing Ukraine's updated NDC. Now, after the war, situations are more worsened. The climate action targets have gone, a minimum 50 years behind. And what I'm trying to say that this problem is not for Ukraine alone. If a country lags behind achieving its climate action targets, it makes impact on the consolidated target of the world. So it has a huge global impact. And we all know that, and I quote Ben Ki-moon, that we don't have any plan B as there is no planet B. So we are well aware of this fact. So more important is not just that how Ukraine will overcome this prevalent social and environmental situation, but I believe what is important is that how such situations are to be avoided in future. So it's not just something has happened and action has to be taken. How we have to take certain measures. The government has to come up with certain policies to ensure that in case if such situation arises, how we come out of that particular thing. And this is all about a deliberation on this just transition.
Yeah, so in fact, Garima, the point I'm taking is that so there is a need to build that conducive policy ecosystem that can help the country remain resilient and ensure that climate action in the strategies, including just transition, it remains resilient despite the volatility coming from geopolitical issues wherever it may be. Let's take a bit of a finance angle to this question. Suranjali and Gurcharan, over to you for your views on this, that while we understand there is that policy requirement from the financing side, what would be your views on this question? Over to you, Suranjali.
Thank you, Surajit. First of all, I'd like to echo some of Garima's thoughts that this is not an event that may not occur in the future. So in that sense, there should be preparedness for events such as this. I think there are two takeaways before I sort of dive into finance, which is one, to say that these events in different forms will take place. And therefore, when countries commit to their net zero target, there should be an alternative plan of what is the switchover. Where will countries sort of redirect their actions when there is an emergency of a different kind. That being said, just transition is a very broad concept. So, since it goes beyond climate, it can be defined in each context, which gives it enough flexibility to be financed by alternative methods and for alternative targets. So, for example, just transition covers the pillars of SDGs. So I would say that even when there are situations such as that we are seeing in Ukraine, just transition would mean taking communities ahead without putting any particular goal ahead of the society. So taking a fair balanced view. Mm-hmm. And I think in terms of finance, it's reflective of how private capital can respond to the needs of the nation. So if you've seen how a banking system, how central banks, etc., have responded to the situation, it means that finance can be proactive, even socially. It's just a matter of political dialogue. In terms of instruments that can be used from here, I think in exceptional circumstances, to leverage capital is much easier through the public finance. I'm talking from just not domestic angle, but international public finance, which would be your development financial institutions. You would need multilateral lending agencies, which are the core of intergovernmental finance, and then of course philanthropies. So philanthropies provide capital. We've seen that even in countries like India, where part of just transition's agenda is being financed by philanthropy. So I would say that new sort of instruments would have to be designed, but from the perspective of the stress that you're seeing right now, public finance would be absolutely critical, not just domestically but internationally.
Thank you. In fact, in many countries, we're already seeing the instrument of outcome-based finance where, not just measurable impact, but it's also the instrument where a lot of philanthropic capital is able to come in without creating very complex structures like, I mean, in a more, in a manner that is more easier to roll out, faster to roll out. But we'll come to that question on instruments with you later. Let me go over to Gursharan. Gursharan, your views on this question on how just transition can be ensured to remain a part of this entire world situation, volatile world situation, it does not get derailed. And let me add a line of thought here that your organization is very closely connected with financial inclusion. So maybe you could bring that into your views as you go along. Over to you, Gursharan.
Right. So this is really an interesting topic. So in fact, just transition is primarily about, having the right policy changes and the right kind of, the direction which the country needs to take at the level of the policy, so that, whenever such a situation arises, like what has arisen in Ukraine, and the impact which the world over, all the countries they are facing, and in order to also kind of imagine, or we could actually have some kind of imaginary situation or a vision in terms of whether this situation like what has come to Ukraine comes to India as well. So what will be the transition, what will be the changes, and what how we have to be prepared in terms of facing a situation like climate, energy, finances, all that stuff. And typically the changes, as in the Gandhian era, what comes to my mind is that instead of going for the macro, we should actually look at the micro also. As at the time of independence, if I look at India's situation when India had a very, very poor economy, and the people were poor, so each and every household unit in India, in the village also was self-sustainable. So this kind of reduce the dependency on somebody from outside coming and giving the sustainability to that particular household. They could produce their own food, they had their own water, they had their own, and their dependence on electricity was very low. So, and they could spin their own clothes. So those kind of stuff. So India is very, very at the lower strata of the economy, or the bottom of the pyramid, society. There the carbon footprint is so low. I mean, if you look at it, the carbon footprint is low. The requirement of finance, or the money is also very low. And still in India, we have that kind of the bottom of the pyramid society where the needs are low, and thereby the sustainability requirements are low. So typically, we have to think about those kind of, options as a society, or as a country, where, we can make people sustainable, survive, and do their own, and, live comfortably, even with situations like this. We have to think micro. I would say that, not only on a macro level, we have to think micro, we have to think build sustainability into the fabric, or into the thought fabric of each and every individual of the country, where, for example, let us say tomorrow, if I have to, think that, being a middle class person, even if I have so many dependencies, I need to have a car, I need to have, an AC in the house, I need to have so and so kind of food and all that stuff. How do I survive? How do I survive? How do I make myself sustainable? How do I reduce the dependency? Tomorrow, let's say the financial situation, or let's say tomorrow situation like Sri Lanka happens, that my currency devalues, whatever money I have in the bank, just it goes like this. And, the value of it, what I'm having, let's say 50 lakhs comes down to a value of just 2 lakhs, 3 lakhs. So how do I survive? So these kind of situations one has to imagine. And these are some of the policy level changes which we have to think as a think tank of the country, as the economist, or the government, or the policy makers. Just transition is all about survival, sustainability in situations, typically now the fact that the whole of Europe is reeling under the prices of gas, which has gone up like anything, and prices of petrol and food availability, all that is not happening. The Ukraine being the grain supplier or the food basket of the world, or Russia being a food basket of the world, their supplies have stopped. So how do people survive? So coming back to now on the financing, right? So we had seen situation in the COVID times. Last to last year, the situation was much more grim, and there was such a huge lockdown. At that point of time, one of the sustaining factor of on the ground level was the postal department, which is again we could say the arms of the government, which was basically reaching out to the people at the deepest nook and corner of the country and supplying them cash, supplying them medicines, supplying them any other essential goods which were required for survival. So those are the kind of things which the government has a distribution network which was strengthened, and typically now it has strengthened because of the digitization of the whole fact, network being available. The telecom has played its part, the digitization and the payment bank or the banking systems have played its part. NPCI and all these, the technology companies, they have fintech companies, they have played their part, and they have made together. They have made these things, the sustainability in such situations much better than what we could have envisaged earlier. Think of the situation in the British era when there was a Bengal famine, and people were dying of hunger and lack of money, supplies, and all that. So today that situation has been avoided. And I would say that we are really proud to have handled that situation in the past practically, and things have improved over the last 2 years. In fact, our networks have improved, our systems have improved, our processes have improved, the cash supplies have improved. So SOPs have been made into place, how the things have to work. So these kind of things we are working on.
Thanks, Gurcharan. In fact, your point about, the entire issue being one of survival reminds me of the point around policies to create resilience of the economy that
Exactly.
Garima mentioned. So I think that's a cue that I should move to Garima next. But before I do that, the other point that you said about the local or micro level, that's also adds a food for thought, because there's also this discussion on the governance delegation. So, at the subnational level, provincial level, local level, how do you ensure, a lot of the climate action, a lot of these initiatives, interventions actually happen at that level and not just at the national level, at the federal level? So this is a question that a lot of countries globally are trying to work out. In fact, new financing schemes are now coming up at the subnational level,
Yes,
as well as municipal level. But we'll talk of that separately. Garima, over to you. You mentioned a bit about the policies. You spoke that Ukraine's climate action was already underway before the war. So I'm just taking a thread from that. So a lot of focus is now coming on the social issues as well. So in your view, what are some of those 2 or 3 key policy actions that you think need to evolve or need to be put in place in order to ensure that just transition is addressed? Over to you.
Thanks, Surajit. So as we all know, that there's no complete agreement over the definition of just transition, right? And as a fundamental element, of achieving social justice or a climate action is imperative for, understanding or for having the just transition. So the key policies which I would say is that one is that, so as we have to imbibe this particular thing within the culture of the corporate sector. So I am just talking on behalf of my institute as a think tank or a Ministry of Corporate Affairs, or we are highlighting the role of corporates here. As the previous speaker was also talking about this thing, this is something, we have to start from individual mindset also. So first is that now Indian government is focusing a lot on self-governance mechanism, right? So one needs to understand the importance of this particular thing. And again, for for a sustainable future for our next generations and all. So one is that by having the emphasis on the self-governance and government providing a lot of such guidelines or a voluntary or the best practices, to adopt that to ensure that there is no negative impact. Second is also about, the policymakers and the stakeholders. They must take stock of communities that will be affected by transitions and communities where transitions are required to achieve the social justice. So the point is, having taking the stock of those particular communities requirement, then also ensuring the social protection to be provided to such community. And as Dr. Tandon highlighted about, creating funds for just transition is also one of the important thing. One more thing I would just like to highlight here is that how we can scale up this just transition. So when we have this, business responsibility and sustainable reporting, which has now made mandatory for the listed companies. So such regulatory framework that provides or that emphasize a lot on environmental issues, which is essential for sustainability. So disclosing to that particular, considering the overall impact of business in those environmental impact. And I'm just connecting with my previous statement is it's not something, when we do if something happens. So it's take, building just transition work early is the most important. So I remember that there are a lot of, such disaster authorities. I'm just giving another example from the Indian perspective, that something happens and then we provide a lot of relief and rehabilitation and everything. But now even the definition under that disaster, act has also being changed to not just provide the post-disaster relief and rehabilitation, but also plan. These things will keep on happening and this can happen anywhere. So taking stock, of that, preparing in advance. So that is something which is very important. And from the policy perspective, it is only that, government can highlight the adoption of best practices, showcase such best practices, or even recognize as a national award for such practices, and provide a framework. And within that, it has to be imbibed in the culture, in the mindset of the each individual.
Thank you, Garima. In fact, where you mentioned perspective on sort of advanced planning or sort of looking ahead of the curve, that gives me the thought that, while regulation is obviously one way to move, the other in history has always been the market forces, right? If the market demand you to do X, you will do X. So in that perspective, I'm just thinking that since a lot of the funding agencies of climate action, from where the funding is coming from, if those funding agencies were also to demand from their investee projects that is there some advanced planning of what can be the potential, all those, and what are especially in context of these geopolitical related risks that can impact climate projects, and what are the resilience mechanisms that are being done, that in itself may push the apple cart on developing the policies, the initiatives of the corporates, the integration of these considerations by the financial institutions and so on. But that's just a thought I'm sharing. Suranjali, you were talking a bit about the products. Let's come back to that here. Mobilizing this entire the finance to fund just transition has always been a key challenge to achieve that goal. So what are your views on how sustainable finance can be leveraged to fund this? What are those 2-3 good mechanisms that can work? What are some of those features of those products or structures that need to be kept in mind towards this? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Surajit. In fact, the finance world is interestingly waking up to the concept of just transition. If you look at the World Benchmarking Alliance, one of the large investors are engaging with corporates specifically on what they are doing on the elements of just transition. And companies that in India that are engaging on it are one of the large PSUs in the oil and gas sector. companies in the coal sector. And how just transition is now shaping is the angle of communities that will be displaced. There's the angle of workers who will lose their jobs. And of course, you have all the other externalities that companies would earlier not price into their decisions. So based on that, investors are now looking for a more firm definition. And as we shape or define the concept of just transition, instruments are also forming quickly on the side. So for example, you have funds that are being set up for the purpose of just transition. You also have impact bonds, which I think have existed for quite some time in the space and are absolutely critical. Why I say that is that they have a very clearly defined outcome. They are linked to social development. It would be, let's say, skill development, employment for women, and all of these are at the core of just transition. Now, the only challenge there being that impact bonds so long have been, small ticket items, and the problem has been of scale. Interestingly, the Indian government recently issued the skill development, impact bond, which I think is a great experiment because it brings together the philanthropies that we were talking about earlier, and it sort of brings in the government's engagement and scales up. So I think more such replicable examples are extremely useful for just transition. Again, at the beginning, I had spoken of the importance of public finance and international public finance. Now, we saw at COP26 that there was the commitment of $100 billion every year. Looking at the demands for transition, so if you look at the estimate that was provided for India, it was $10 trillion over the next couple of decades. Keeping that in mind, this $100 billion may not particularly suffice for all countries, and I guess there needs to be an engagement with MDBs and DFIs on how they internally look at just transition, how willing they are to flex themselves on the incorporation of carbon-based sectors in their portfolio, but to use that finance in part again for activities that are aligned with just transition. The other thing that comes to my mind is that hardcore public finance and in the domestic market will remain important. Today, India spends about 24 lakh crores in total on revenue and capital expenditure. Now, some of these heads, if you were to go line by line, actually are aligned with just transition because they're looking at energy, they're looking at rural development, etc. So I would say that when we define it, we also look back at the current budget and imagine what the scaling up may be required. Interestingly, what we would see over the next couple of years, there would be a very different impact of this transition on a country, let's say, which is oil dependent, and a country which is oil consuming, right? Oil dependent for revenue. So there will be countries that will see an increase in their public finance because of rising energy prices, and then later taper off because of reduction in the consumption globally. And for countries like India, you might see that the revenues from, let's say from excise, etc., might taper off. And that requires imagining a new carbon market. For example, do we have a carbon tax? Do we have an ETS, which helps you create funds for the future in some sense? So I would imagine that again would be a very critical element, because as much as we say that companies can do the right thing, there are limits to finance. They also have to cater to their shareholders. They have to provide returns. So I would say it would be just transition would be an experiment of a large scale in public-private partnerships. And each of these elements that I've spoken of, whether you have large institutional investors like the big fund managers who are now they have their proprietary framework on just transition. Then there are companies which have started undertaking reskilling of employees and impact bonds, as well as DFIs and MDBs. All of them will come together to bridge that gap for financing just transition. And on the way, there will be product innovations.
Thanks, Suranjali. And I'm just adding maybe two postscripts here, that something I firmly believe that sustainable finance is as much about managing different constituencies of people as it is about the product, because you have people from different perspectives. Development sector thinks differently, finance, commercial finance thinks differently, policy thinks differently, and it's a very big people management exercise to bring everyone on the same page and create a solution that is okay with all of them. And the other part really where a lot of the outcome based impact funding probably can scale up from the small ticket size to the larger ones, is about the verification of that outcome data. And that verification, whether you call it monitoring, evaluation, IMM, whatever different names, same thing. That verification process, especially in something like just transition, where reskilling, to bring them back into the work stream in alternate career forms, that reskilling and ensuring that the learning is achieved, the quality of learning is achieved to make them employable or to make them job ready in that new area. That outcome, verification of that outcome is so critical that I think there is a huge opportunity from both the policymakers and service providers and financiers to address that gap. Gursharan, let me go over to you. From this perspective, that in a conflict situation, you basically have a problem of cash, and most developing countries are cash dominant. So from a social risk perspective, institutions like yourselves, you're working towards creating that last mile connect, financial inclusion, and that is so relevant at times like, volatile times like this. So how do you see a role of your type of organizations expanding in context of these conflict situations? Over to you.
Yeah. So, basically, see, if you look at it, there are three factors which are involved in this, right? One is the top-down and bottom-up approach. Basically, what is the policymakers think? What are the the enablers which are being created, for the for making the money reach into the hands of the real needy people into the far corners of the country. The second is the development of the attitude, right? So one typically, for example, let's say a person in a remote corner of the country, he may feel that only cash in hand is something which I need. I may and he does not know about the digital money, the digital transactions, and how he can transact digitally, right? So that basically is one of the typical factors which we have to really think about, which we are working on, and we are doing lots and lots of these financial literacy camps, which is again financed by Ministry of Corporate Affairs, by NABARD. So there are financial inclusion funds. So we're doing lots of camps. We are trying to spread that literacy or the knowledge about digital transactions, mobile banking, etc. So this is one thing. The third is creation of the ecosystem, right? For example, now currently, a person who wants to buy, let's say, grocery, or he wants to, pay for any of the utilities, he feels that, he needs to have cash in his hand. If we create a merchant ecosystem, which has now been made very, very easy, to have a merchant ecosystem. Earlier, if you remember, there used to be an EPOS machine, a POS machine, which used to cost about 6,000 to 10,000 rupees just to accept digital cash through a debit card or through a credit card. Now that is replaced by just a 5 rupee QR sticker, and that enables him to accept cash digitally. And everybody, he becomes, a merchant who can accept digital cash. So this ecosystem is now being carried by us into the far corners of the country. Today we have, something called a Saksham village concept. Saksham village concept is where, for example, let's say out of, say 200 or 100 merchants, or say 50 merchants in the village, let us say we are saying that at least 50 to 60% merchants are made enabled to accept cash, digital money or a digital transaction. So this kind of concept is being taken to all the corners of the country, so that not only the villager, his requirement of cash in hand reduces, but also the merchant, his requirement of accepting cash reduces. So you can accept a digital cash. There is no problem of currency change. There is no problem of handling soiled notes. There is no problem of insurance of the cash being to be carried. So all those things are being taken care of by creating this ecosystem. So the main thing is about the attitude has to be created. So typically, earlier what used to happen was that the merchant used to feel ki if I accept more and more digital cash or digital money, I'll come into the tax net, I will not be able to save GST and all those stuff that he used to have, and he'll have not have to pay this income tax. So all those things, now we have to change that mindset. Like for example, in Swachh Bharat, what happened? The main problem was not going to the people with money and giving them the funding for constructing a toilet, but the main problem was attitude. So here again, we feel that attitude change is one of the biggest factors. So this availability of cash, of course, the instruments are there to make availability of cash also at the doorstep. By just doing a biometric, he can just put his thumbprint and he can withdraw money from any bank anywhere in the country. So that is being provided at the doorstep. But also creating an ecosystem is part of our game plan in terms of making the sustainability in terms of cash availability in any situation, come what may. I mean, there could be a famine, there could be a drought, there could be a natural catastrophe, or there could be a war or anything of that sort. And you would be happy to note that even there are pictures that in a boat in a flood situation, our postman has delivered cash using his biometric even on a boat in a flood situation. So those kind of things also we have handled, and we have created that kind of cash availability at the doorstep. So this is, I feel, one of the factors which we need to look into.
Thanks, Gurcharan. That I think that's a fantastic example of commitment also towards service delivery of the postman in the boat. We have exactly 15 minutes left, so let me take this opportunity to ask all our panelists, and since we have the good fortune to get all these excellent panelists on this forum, one more round of questions, so that we take use of the time. Garima, over to you. India has been one of the first countries to come out with mandated laws on CSR allocation. And now the entire sustainability disclosures in the form of the BRSR framework has also come about. Now, IIC has been involved in this. How do you think that BRSR framework and the data can feed into making policies around just transition, such that it delivers on issues related to livelihoods, food security? Suranjali mentioned about skilling and so on and so forth. Over to you, Garima.
So CSR, corporate social responsibility, again, if we go back to the history, it started from philanthropy to voluntary best practices and then becoming a mandate. Similarly, the business responsibility and sustainable reporting that seeks disclosure from the top 1,000 listed companies on their performance against those 9 principles of national guidelines on responsible business conduct. And there we know that each principle is divided into certain minimum expectation as an essential indicators, and then there are leadership indicators. So BRSR is intended towards having a qualitative and a standardized disclosures on ESG parameters, environment, social governance, to enable the comparability across companies, sectors, and time. And again, this is going to help even investors from having their investment decisions, but it shall also enable companies to engage more meaningfully with their stakeholders by encouraging them to look beyond financials and towards social and environmental impact. So briefly, I'll just say, that this business responsibility and sustainability reporting, which is now mandate for 1,000 companies, it say there's a dedicated one principle focusing on the environment, and all the principles, are, it has cross-referred. So, for example, in one of the principle, we are even asking that, percentage of research and development and capital expenditure to improve the environment and social impact of production and process. So there's a lot of emphasis on R&D activities, and not just asking that whether you have how much percentage, but the details of improvements in the environmental and social impact. So this will, enable the corporates to be ready for such particular situations in future. Further, it also asks about any significant social or environmental concerns or risks arising from the production or disposal of your product. So it factors the entire life cycle perspective or assessment, and it asks about action taken also for that particular thing. So such kind of provisions, again, emphasize a lot on the transparency and disclosures, and somewhere, it motivates everyone to think about such causes also. Then it also talks about, very importantly, is the process for consultation between stakeholders and the governing body of company, on economic, environmental, and social topics. So it's not just asking whether you are engaging the stakeholders, but what is the process of engagement, and as we know that just transition is thinking, different, as you've highlighted, they're thinking about everybody, right? So it's not just that, we ask that you must have a stakeholder consultation, but also disclose the process for consultation also. Further, the principle 6 asks in detail about businesses should respect and make efforts to protect and restore the environment. And there's a lot of fuel consumption, energy consumption, everything has to be, stated in figures, not just in English language. Then there is a lot of environmental laws are there, which again has to be specified, that whether the approvals have been taken, whether there's a compliance. Importantly, there is also something on environmental impact assessment, as we are also today talking about relating the just transition with the climate action. So the details of the environmental impact assessment. So it's not just, in the initial days, we were talking only about the corporate social responsibility impact, what is happening on ground, but even EIA is something which has been highlighted. And lastly, because of the paucity, I'll just quickly say that it talks about significant adverse impact to the environment arising from the value chain of the entity, right? And then what measures have been taken by such entity. So, having all these figures by several companies, and then, the government is seriously thinking about providing them the framework provided by the government of India in all these respects.
Thank you, Garima. So we understand that the BRSR includes a lot of those components that can help address the question around just transition, and the comprehensive process of arriving or the disclosing that is also covered. And maybe there is an opportunity to sort of create an additional, publication or, a piece on the mapping part of it, so that those audiences, especially the DFIs who are very interested to know how a particular project will address just transition, then how that maps to the existing BRSR framework, so that Indian companies who are doing such initiatives can then use that to sort of showcase that outcome. But Suranjali,
BRSR is also mapped with SDGs as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Suranjali, let me take a quick question, a quick answer from you on this, on a slightly controversial topic around coal. So in the case of just transition in India, there's been a lot of debate around large-scale coal mines, a lot of decentralized small-scale operations would also get impacted in this space. So in your view, what can be done to ensure there are no adverse impact at the grassroots level from the just transition perspective. Over to you, Suranjali.
Thanks, Shubhajit. I also want to sort of quickly say that India is working on a taxonomy for green in India, and that, in a sense, incorporates the sense of just transition for India. So, when we do see the face of it, perhaps we get a sense of how to map activities that are ESG compliant along with just transition.
Sure.
Just to your specific question, yes, coal has been contentious. But it's a value chain that operates around coal. So the job losses that we're talking about are not always direct; they're indirect, because you will also see a technological shift in allied sectors, right? Like iron and steel and cement, and there's already work underway. So there are massive number of jobs that will be impacted by that. Now, what can be done? As you rightly pointed out, we have to go down to the local level and understand what the direct and indirect impacts of these decentralized activities, as you're saying, is. Now, to do that, there should be a district level assessment. So when we talk about taxonomy, when we talk about reporting, it's all national level. But we have to go down to the district level to understand who are the impacted communities. So one way is to initiate dialogue, which is already underway by small groups of NGOs and think tanks trying to assess what will be the social impact of, let's say, phasing down of coal. And it's not just about phasing down of coal, I might add. Today, agriculture is the most vulnerable sector, because of extreme weather events, and then there are other allied effects of emissions. So I would say that there needs to be a district level assessment, and of course, for coal dependent regions, there's already a public finance instrument called the District Mineral Fund, which can be scaled for local level communities. So long as coal exists there, and perhaps it can be imagined on how to sequester again that source of revenue to help the impacted communities. So my sense is that look at sectors which are not just coal for sure, and also don't look at direct jobs, look at indirect jobs and communities around, and then imagine a plan around it. So, for example, World Bank right now is collaborating with Ministry of Mines to come up with a just transition framework in different parts. So that is one way to also think about it from the policy angle.
So in fact, what you just said reminds me of something I've heard before, that climate risk is actually not a risk. It's a risk multiplier, because it's a manifold of many risks. So even just transition is actually to be seen from that multiplier from across various sectors, across initiatives. Final question to you, Gursharan. Digitalization has been a hallmark of financial inclusion initiatives. All the payments bank like yourselves have also been pioneering that. With a lot of all this digitalization happening in economies like India, the erstwhile post office system was losing its relevance. Now, establishment of the India Post Payments Bank has injected a sort of new life, not only into post offices, but also the digital enabled financial services, if I call it that. So what did the India Post Payments Bank really do to successfully roll out its operations reach, and how does it envisage looking at issues around just transition, given that you're working with some of your customers are people right at the grassroots levels who are very closely impacted by these issues? Over to you, Gursharan. We just have another 5 minutes, so we'll have to go after that. Yeah, thank you.
Exactly. So, very good question. In fact, in 2018, when the Prime Minister, in fact, launched this bank, the idea was to take the banking services to the last mile and to the every nook and corner of the country. Now, the challenge was typically to, reduce the cost, and also to have some kind of an assisted banking, right? So now, as I told you in my previous dialogue also, that, the problem was changing the mindset, whether the adoption of the technology by a person in the village or a rural person is easy or not. So for adoption, he needs to have some kind of an assisted mode of transaction in a digital method, or in a digital mode, at least 3 to 4 times or 5 times. As they say that, before a person adopts something new, he needs at least 4 to 5 iterations, right? On the 5th or 6th one, he becomes comfortable and he starts doing it himself. So the idea was that the postman, with the factor of the trust, because the postman has been there in the village for so many years, he knows him personally, he can trust him. So therefore, the trust factor along with the assisted banking. And the third was the economy or the frugal technology, which we took. Right down to the doorstep of the rural village folk, was that, for example, let's say opening a savings bank account, the cost of opening a savings bank account before.
Gursharan, I seem to have lost your audio, or is it a problem at my end?
He's on mute, I think.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So I'm sorry. So what I was saying is that, the next step now we are getting into is the capital formation or capital formation participation right up to tier 4, 5, 6 levels. So there also we are going to play a big role, and also the extension of the availability of the loans. So typically the availability of loans through account aggregators, as you know, that payment banks cannot offer loans on their books. So, or the asset products now will be offered in collaboration with large financial institutions and banks like Axis Bank, SBI, and also we have tied up with them. And through account aggregators and loan service provider, availability, we will become the loan service providers through aggregator route. So this again is some of the things. Again, I would say that technology, again the policy level, this is again going to play a very, very, very typical role. So as you know that, there used to be something called an MDR. When a person used to transact through a credit card or a debit card, the merchant had to pay around 2% as a fee. This has been brought down to nothing, by the policymakers, that is the Reserve Bank of India and the Government of India. So this has made this, the transaction or a digital transaction sustainable, the methodology. So all these things are, combined, they have enabled us, and that is what is creating the.
Thank you, Gursharan, for those views. With this, since we're out of time, let's also close. Warm thanks to all our panelists, and thanks to you, Anup, and your team. With this, over to you.